Kia ora koutou, and welcome to another Friday Night with COVID special with Dr. Ben Peters. Kia ora, Ben. How you doing?
Kia ora, Geoff. Thank you for having me. I'm good. I'm a little on the tired side, but amped for another live.
Nice. And how are things down in Dunedin there?
Oh, they're good. Spring is well and truly upon us, so all of our beautiful blossom trees are out. The magnolias are flowering. There's one magnolia at university that, when it flowers, is considered as springtime. It's like the signal for spring, and so everyone
Oh,
waits for that magnolia to come out. So that's happened. Spring is here. It's still cold, but otherwise we're going pretty good.
yeah, nice. Spring in Wellington means that the wind really picks up. So
Yeah, no,
yeah,
I like Dunedin's climate. It's pretty chill. We've had very little rain. It's been quite lovely, really.
nice. Hey, well, I have to say, with the sort of election campaign moving into full swing, we don't have those 1 p.m. Uh, you know, COVID presses every day. So I guess it's kind of not top of mind for a lot of people. But of course, the cluster in Auckland is carrying on, and so we'll talk a little bit about the current state of play, Ben, and then if people want to start sending in their questions, we will get to your questions all in good time. I guess the big news of the week was around this Mount Roskill cluster, Ben.
Mm. Yeah, so this is I think for the first time we're really categorizing that cluster as a church group that's happened, and we've got a little subcluster coming in there from a bereavement meeting. So there would have been some kind of funeral that happened there. And so we've got effectively a group of people who Chris Hipkins is telling us that they weren't taking COVID particularly seriously, which is quite problematic. And then that's part of the reason why it's been quite hard to keep a handle on it, is because they haven't been, on the whole, they've been very compliant. And I read just today that 80% of them have been retested already, because there was that call for it, just to make sure that we could catch everyone there. So yeah, that is it. It's a bit concerning. I was reading a news article today that Phil Goff has said that part of the issue with this cluster is that the people who aren't taking it seriously, the reason they're not taking it seriously is an intellectual issue. And I take quite a lot of issue with that, because
Yeah,
to be honest, bar people who are actual virologists or immunologists or very well educated in science, most people are just taking what is told to them on face value. That's just that their source is the government. Other people don't trust the government very much, or don't trust authority figures, and then get that information from somewhere else. And to actually understand the statistics of COVID, or to understand actually what's going on, takes an awful lot of training and research. And so I find it very difficult to say, oh, it's because they're dumb. I'm like, actually, it's just because the information that they're trusting is not good information.
sorry, I just got a
And
SCOBY in my kombucha. If you're wondering what happened there, Ben, that
yeah,
was
I got to be honest, I'm not a fan of kombucha.
yeah. That
I
just
love
happened.
fermenting stuff. I'll homebrew any day. The
Yeah,
idea of just open top fermentation on whatever goes in there, and we're going to call that health. I'm just a bit. I like it to be a little bit more controlled. I like to know
yeah.
what yeast I'm putting into my beers. Um,
Yeah. Anyway,
but
sorry. Back to the issue of trust. Yes.
yeah, and I think
I trust my kombucha.
I don't, but it's not an intellect issue. And so I
No.
think that's really the point there, is that
Yeah.
it damages that public relation. It damages that trust when you have those authority figures saying, oh, you're dumb for not believing what we tell you. When to actually analyze that data for yourself is really hard. And half the time you don't even have access to it. So, you can try and look up these studies, and you won't be able to get them because they're behind paywalls or whatever. Even some newspapers are behind paywalls at the moment. And so there's a lot of stuff where you just don't have access to that good information.
Yeah. And
YouTube
I
is
think and
theory
I think
free.
that has been one criticism of the the government's response, is that there could be more transparency, but they have, and they have actually done, put out a lot more information in more recent times than they had originally. So some credit to them there. But you can always be more transparent, can't you?
Yeah, and there are definitely ways in which they can make that data more accessible as well. So like the 1 p.m. updates were great. Actually digging in and grabbing that data is not like, unless it was in the 1 p.m. update, it was hard to know how up to date the Ministry of Health website was. And then we also had Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister, say, don't trust the website as much as the podium, which was kind of problematic as well, because really those two things should be the same. So that was around the issue with the website, and the official accounts were saying go get tested, and it wasn't. And so I think that's messaging saying trust only the podium is quite concerning, and I might be casting it in a slightly negative light there, but it is. I think overall New Zealanders have great trust in the government. There are people that have less trust. I think when we frame it as it's an issue with Christians, or it's an issue with the church, or I've heard people going, oh, it's those Polynesian families with their big families and their church that's the problem. I like, that's really problematic, and I think we need to go back to that. I'm a Christian myself, so to try and say all Christians are stupid, I would challenge you there. So it's definitely a thing where people can have a lot of different beliefs, and they can sometimes make people less trusting of government sources or not, but we need to be respectful of those, whether it's beliefs around, your cultural heritage and your worldview, however that aligns or doesn't align with the government. And I think we need to make a lot of effort in bringing people back into the fold, rather than trying to make sure that they stay just small out there groups, to go, actually, how do we re-engage with these communities? How do we bring them back in? New Zealand used to have one of the highest vaccination rates, right? In 2008, I think we literally had the #1 vaccination rate in the world. And then we stopped caring about public health as much. We don't engage with those communities as much. And then the vaccination rate falls. There's some correlation there with also Facebook usage and just general social media becoming the norm of media distribution. And then New Zealand was responsible for that measles outbreak that killed hundreds of children in Samoa. So like, it has real consequences when we don't put public health first, and when we don't have those good programs that keep that trust high.
Yeah. And I really do feel that we, because the worst of that outbreak happened overseas, we really didn't face the full consequences of that as a country.
No. And like, I don't even know what even occurs because of that, right? Top at the moment is calling for a public health commission to be reestablished, so that we can have that focus on public health. And vaccinations are a huge public health issue, because good vaccination programs save so much money, so much time, and so many lives. So it's very important, I think, that we do put that absolutely at the center of any kind of health response.
And while we're talking about this Mount Roskill cluster, Ben, the other interesting issue was the the contact trace that kind of got missed. The undisclosed contact, which sounds like it was someone having a boyfriend or girlfriend that their parents probably didn't know about. So pretty tricky situation, but it does.
Sorry, Mum.
Yeah, absolutely. But it does raise all sorts of interesting questions, right? Like, should you contact trace that you've been to the tinny house to get some weed?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question, and I think, like, obviously we'd love for everybody, if they ever do come in contact with COVID, that they tell them every little detail possible, because that's so important. But you don't want to be the one that dobs in your deal or gets someone in trouble and all of that. And I mean, I've had that situation, not even in a COVID sense, but like just in my flatting life, and at times where situations have gotten kind of hairy, and I wouldn't mind if the police came, but knowing that if the police came, then some people around me might get in trouble for the substances that they have. So it's always that really tricky thing, especially something like weed, which is so common, that it means that actually a lot of people, right? We've had a lot of cases in New Zealand where we're up at a couple thousand, I think, at the moment. It would be very statistically unlikely that none of them had gone and bought weed sometime during their infectious period. And you're kind of going, I wonder how how much that's slowing down the wagon? Do we need some kind of government messaging being like, okay, whatever we find in the process of contact tracing, we're going to make sure doesn't result in other people getting in trouble. It's entirely about just making sure that we can keep the virus under control, and for a period there may be an amnesty around things. But I mean, you would need to spend some time thinking about whether that's the most appropriate way or what you can do. Obviously, long term, let's decriminalize weed, let's make it legal, let's tax it, let's regulate it, and that will take out a huge portion of those concerns. And I guess it highlights the problem when governments drag their heels, right? Sometimes you get to a point where you go, crap, it's a bit late. we can't change it now. It's a bit late, and that's a problem.
Yeah. This was actually, this is for many a good reason to have so government services delivered by non-governmental organizations. So for example, I've met some community housing providers who say that their tenants are more comfortable talking to them than they are to Housing New Zealand, about issues that come up, because people are worried, because Housing New Zealand's government, that the things that are talked about are going to get back to the authorities through one way or another. And so so actually sometimes having these frontline services delivered by communities really does help to kind of provide that degree of separation from government. Which I mean, from the sounds of it, that kind of is happening with this COVID response, and that they are engaging community groups to help them with testing and contact tracing.
I was reading a quick article that showed that or they mentioned that especially around Pacifica groups, that they can be quite distrusting of police, and because there's a lot of history there, and so it was really reassuring that the police were pulling back a wee bit and letting kind of community leaders help in that space. There are some really interesting kind of legal questions that come up. I saw one, or I was talking with a friend, and they were mentioning that we are getting the army in to manage a lot of these MIQ facilities. Managed isolation or quarantine facilities are two separate things, but but the army isn't actually allowed to enforce upon civilians. It's kind of their whole thing, is that they don't enforce anything that the civilians. So an armyman can't tell you what to do because you're a civilian and they're entirely separate. But they can if a police officer next to them gives them the power to do that, but they have to be quite closely linked. And so there's some interesting kind of legal questions going on around how much can the army actually manage these facilities in the absence of police. Does it really need to be both of them there, and how close do they need to be acting together in order to not run afoul of the law? But that's kind of like more academic interest than the practicalities of just making sure that we're not getting people escaping and things like that.
Yeah, so lots happening still in Auckland. Any thoughts, Ben, on? I mean, this cluster doesn't seem to be shutting down anytime soon. There's supposed to be a decision, I believe, Monday about whether we stay in level 2. Have you got any thoughts on all of that?
I don't like to gamble, but I mean, it's not. The most positive news is that it's not increasing, right? Day on day, where all the numbers are still sub 10 every day. It's got a long, slow tail there, but it's not like we're getting an increase day on day, that it looks like it's escaped out of the perimeter that we think we know, and that we are actually catching cases fairly quickly before they've had a long transmission chain. So it does look like we're on top of it. I think it's unexpected that it took this long to get on top of it because of some of those issues around trust and undisclosed contacts and things like that. But yeah, so I think it is one of those things where I don't know what the government's going to do, right? Like, I guess in their mind, it depends how much, and this is the problem with having the COVID right near an election, is that everything they're doing with the thought of how does this affect our campaigning. They're not possibly as up to date at being online as we are. I think we're absolutely killing it in the online space, which is great. And even my Facebook engagements are better than both Michael Woodhouse's and David Clark's, even though they've got thousands more followers. So,
Yeah, well, I was looking today. We are on Facebook. We're third behind Labour and National.
Look
and
at that.
That's right across the platform. So, I mean, to be outperforming the Greens on Facebook is
Absolutely.
pretty extraordinary stuff.
Yeah, no, we're doing really well in that space. But I think the major parties are very much thinking, right, level 2, it looks kind of bad to do door knocking. It looks kind of bad to do some of those classic things that they get to do, and they have a lot of resources to do. And so they might be looking at, well, maybe if we drop down, it's still 4 weeks from the election. So they might wait 1 week and then drop down. And that will also give a bit more time for the cluster to go down a wee bit and kind of make people a bit more reassured. Level 2, I mean, maybe like the Auckland goes from the 2.5 down to the 2 or something, right? You still keep all of those other good things in place. You keep mask wearing on buses in place. You keep your big gatherings small. But then largely, level 2 isn't that restrictive, right? My day-to-day doesn't change that much. Work actually is a bit horrendous because we run undergraduate labs and we have quite a lot of students in there. And so we're having to do lots of things to try and keep that all running happily. So I would love if we went to level 1, it would make my daily life easier. But I feel like the greatest risk is that the numbers start increasing.
Yeah.
And if that happens, that looks really bad on Labour, regardless of how much it actually is up to them. And so I think probably the overall idea there is to be a little bit more on the cautious side.
Yeah.
And New Zealanders on the whole are liking being more on the cautious side, especially because it seems to be paying off when we look overseas and we see a lot of places that weren't are doing really poorly compared to how well we're doing.
Yeah. A lot of countries talking about stepping back up effectively what, their alert levels, I guess. I don't know if they have as formalized systems as us, but certainly things seem to be getting more stricter overseas. Other big news, Ben, this week was around the pause in the trial of the vaccine.
Yeah, so there's a number of different vaccine candidates out there. In fact, the New York Times has a really nice vaccine tracker that you can go through. It tells you where all the vaccines are and at what stage. Yeah, it's great. Sorry, but one of the leading vaccines, it's the Oxford vaccine. I think it's sometimes called ChAdOx1. It was in a phase 3 trial. Well, this is where it's going out to tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of patients, and having a vaccine administered. There was an adverse event that triggered an independent review. So what that means is someone got sick, and they aren't telling us how sick or exactly what it was, but someone got sick enough that they were like, right, we need to stop the vaccine trial right now. We're not going to recruit any more people on. We're going to have an independent body come in and have a look and see, is this likely to have been caused from the vaccine, or is it actually part of just the baseline level of illness that you see in any large group of people, right? If you have 100,000 people in a room, a few of them will have a seizure just at any given time because there are so many people and there are underlying conditions that will happen. And the question they'll be asking is it unusual that this particular illness has happened? And is there any other thing that we can attribute it to? Or is it likely actually the vaccine itself that has been triggered? Now, there's a couple of things there. Mostly it's going to be, we'll wait and see what happens. Part of it is actually enormously reassuring that even with all of the pressure that's on, that at the point of a single illness that rose to that level of severity, that they paused that trial. Right, that's actually reassuring that they are still taking the most serious thing, which is safety first, rather than trying to rush it through. And there are a couple of vaccines that are approved in very limited senses that the Chinese government and the Russian government are rolling out in various ways. I think because they have a much greater impetus at trying to make sure that I think they have slightly less concerns about individuals in their population is probably the nicest way of saying that. Whereas here in New Zealand, we're very, very concerned about any individual that may be adversely affected, which is why we're definitely taking that safety first approach. So it's very interesting, and I'm reassured that they're taking those safety steps, even though it might delay the length of time until we see that vaccine.
This is not a question from anyone, but we will get to people's questions in just a moment. My question to you, Ben, is would you take the Russian or Chinese vaccine?
if they showed me the data, right? Like, so this is the issue, is that they're just not very open about their data.
Yeah,
And in principle, I would. Like, I understand what the vaccine is, and I'm like, that's a sensible way of designing a vaccine. But unless I know the data, I don't think, like I would want
yeah,
some level
cool.
of security. And I also want to just know, like, at the moment in New Zealand, we've got very few cases, right? And it would be selfish of me to go and get the vaccine and then come back and no one else around me have it. And it's not actually nearly as effective as if we get an actual rollout. So I'm very happy to be one of the first ones to get vaccinated. I would also just want to make sure that's not at the expense of the people who really need it, who are more at risk.
That's very societal thinking of you, Ben. I can't think of the word to describe it. Some questions now. First one from Gavin. In either of your opinions, are there any low-hanging fruit to improve the government's response to COVID?
Oh, yeah. The lowest hanging fruit has to be pool testing. So we currently test one swab per person, one reaction per person. The government has the capacity, they've told us at one of these 1 p.m. updates, as part of that transparency thing, it'll be kind of nice to know, in some easier to find format, that they have the capacity to do pool testing. That's where you would take swabs of 10 people, put it all into one tube, and then test that one tube. And when you have really low positive rates, it's really easy to do that. And it's really common that that whole set of 10 will be negative. And that's part of how Wuhan tested all 5 million. No, they've got not quite 10 million in Wuhan. They did about 10 million people tested by doing that pooled approach. And you can do some really nifty math things to make sure that you don't have to retest people if you want to. So you sort the samples, but that's getting a bit technical. So to me, that would be the most obvious one. And even if it like to do genuine full asymptomatic testing of everybody is going to be too much, but certain at risk groups or areas where you can see that it's likely or possible for those clusters to pop up, having semi-frequent testing of those could just make people feel a little bit more reassured that we are on the front foot of actively seeking out the virus, rather than going, oh, we're a bit overwhelmed. Like when that Auckland cluster happened, I rang up the doctor because my kids had a bit of a cough, and I was like, "Can I take them in and get a test?" And but because we didn't have any contact with anyone from Auckland and their symptoms were relatively mild, they thought, "No, we won't bother testing them at this point," right? Because so many other people were calling at the same time, and so I think having that, I know testing is the name there, but actually there are some really innovative protocols that are happening that we could be putting in place, and there are that pool testing as well. I think could be really interesting to actually just get those bulk numbers up and just reassure people that want tests even if they don't have any symptoms. And I've also seen some things around saliva testing being, pardon me, pretty good. It's slightly less sensitive, but you might make up for that if you're doing really just a wide cast of the net. That would be my thought on the COVID side of things.
Yeah, and I guess for me, and we've talked about this before, Ben, but I really do think that the quarantine could be scaled up. We could be charging foreigners to cover the cost of that, and I totally agree with your point, Ben, that we should be doing as much of that outside of our largest economic centre as possible.
Yeah.
Um,
I guess like a UBI.
yeah.
The thing that top campaigns on the most. Like if we roll out a UBI, start supporting customers that in terms of low hanging fruit for getting the economy going. That's right. Just seems
That's right, and of course, we do have a UBI proposal which is fiscally neutral. But if you wanted to do a stimulus UBI, then I mean the Reserve Bank's printing $100 million to give to banks, to $100 billion to give to banks.
That's big money.
Yeah.
That's big money.
Just to keep interest rates down, which is going to lead to higher house prices and yeah. So I mean, we could just give that to the people if you wanted a stimulus response, which is yeah. So there's some low-hanging fruit for you, Gavin. Here's a here's a good question for you, Ben. Who would win in a rap battle between Billy TK and Dr. Ashley Bloomfield?
Billy, I haven't spent much time listening to Billy.
He does have a musical background. I think he's a guitarist.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. But I think Ashley Bloomfield is probably the better speaker. So
It's definitely this, but I don't know if that's the main quality there. I'm leaning towards Billy. Like I just think Ashley Bloomfield in his daily life uses far too many long multisyllabic words that won't rhyme very well.
Yeah, but you got to think of the words that end in Asian, Ben. There's lots of words that end in shin.
Yeah.
And I'm sure Ashley could do a whole rap based on that.
Yeah. Like a vaccination leader of the nation.
The vaccination nation.
Yeah.
This is the implication for our vaccination nation.
Yeah, we'll get you in there. My vote's for Geoff.
Okay, back to serious questionings. One here from Christy. Do you think the vaccine will be made compulsory, or will there be repercussions if you don't have the vaccine, e.g. denied daycare, denied jobs, etc.?
I really hope not. It's really low-hanging fruit for politicians. They love to go, yeah, we'll be hard on vaccines. We'll make sure everybody has one, and you can't come to school if you don't. And all that does,
Aussies love that sort of stuff, right? I mean,
it's what it does is you suddenly see that the school vaccination rate jumps from 88 to 94, 96, whatever percent. And then you also see your homeschooling rate jump from 2% up to 8%. So what actually happens is people don't go to school. They then get more and more marginalized, and then they're more disengaged from the health system. They're also then not going to tell people that they're not vaccinated. And then that's where you get those outbreaks happening. So it's really counterproductive to actually make the vaccines mandatory.
Yeah.
Especially a vaccine that's been developed on this timescale. Like absolutely we're putting the safety first of that vaccine, but we do want to be very sure that it is reaching that level of safety, and you want to be giving people the option of taking it, and a huge number will. And I think especially if we have some high and prominent figures being very open about taking the vaccine and showing that, I've held all of my children for their vaccinations, and it's not an easy thing to do. They don't really like it. I've been vaccinated myself recently as well for travel and things like that. And so I understand that people don't love it. And I think, though, if we have an effective public health message, then you can actually get really good vaccination rates, and it doesn't require mandating it. It doesn't require a heavy fist, because it doesn't actually work, and there's international research showing that. So I really hope we don't, is my answer.
Yeah. Someone's response just to your answer in that one is, I wish Ben could be our next Minister of Health after the election. Well, if you live in Dunedin, folks, you can vote for Ben instead of the old Minister of Health. And
see, I have a question. Is an ex-minister called ex-honourable?
The previously honourable.
Honourable. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure they keep the honourable title, or is that only if they're a right honourable that they keep it? I think maybe it's only right honourable. Anyway,
I haven't investigated the title thing. I spent a long time getting my last title, so maybe
you don't need another one.
Wouldn't mind it though. We'll see what happens.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I remember working for Dr. Michael Cullen, and he was right honourable, the Dr. Michael Cullen.
It gets a bit of a mouthful, eh?
There was a lot to take in, yeah.
Yeah, I did spend many years playing computer games where I wanted to get those titles in front of your name on the computer games, and now I've got one. So
win. Question from Libby, and I have to say, Ben, I don't understand this question, so I hope you do.
That's all right.
It's the kind of question that sounds like you might know what it means. What should we do for the COVID long haulers and other ME sufferers?
Yeah,
so the UN says we're entitled to home help and other support, but we don't get it from WINS.
Right. So the COVID long haulers are the ones that are suffering from COVID for a very long time, and we're talking
Right.
months here.
Mm.
And so I've looked a little bit and tried to start finding some statistics on this, and it's a wee bit hard to find how many people this is affecting. ME, I'm not sure what your acronym is there. Nothing's coming to mind immediately, but if you put it in the
Let's
chat,
just stick
maybe.
with the COVID long
Yeah.
haulers for
So
now.
the COVID long haulers.
Which can I just interject, Ben? I mean, this is another big reason why elimination is such a big deal, right? I mean, whenever people start getting into the stats and comparing overseas, and we can spend months talking about that stuff, but the fact is there's huge uncertainties about the long-term implications of this disease, right?
Yep. Yeah. And I would really rest on that uncertainty, right? We don't know what proportion of people are negatively affected for a long time. We don't know how severe that is. It could end up being an enormous cost to us because those long haulers are going to be in the hospital for a lot of that time, and they're going to have a lot of reoccurring issues, which could be very problematic. But we don't actually know to what extent that is true, right? We're only living with this virus so far for 7-8 months, so we've got quite a limited data set to actually understand that. But there are some troubling signs that we should be aware of. The main issue, I think, around the people themselves who have that is a question of
chronic fatigue syndrome, Ben. Sorry to interrupt.
Chronic fatigue.
It's chronic fatigue. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you. So I guess the wider question there is around the health response to people who have chronic conditions like chronic fatigue, where it's difficult to get that recognized. Chronic fatigue is one that's recently, I think, I don't know if it's actually been like fully recognized by the medical community. It's one of those ones that's there was a lot of contention over what is it actually. My fibromyalgia is another one like that, where a lot of people like it's a genuine thing, but it's taken a while for the medical community to really adopt and accept that, which then makes it very hard to access the appropriate benefits that are required. And again, I think that's where an overhaul of our welfare system goes an awfully long way. We'd still need to, like UBI.
Yep. Which just gives people the flexibility. Like if there's a community of people looking after someone, just like people raising kids, if there's a community of people looking after someone who's ill, then the UBI honors all that unpaid work, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You'd still need that top up then for those people who would qualify currently under the sickness benefit or the appropriate terms around that. And again, for the COVID long haulers, that's really important. If it is impacting your ability that you can't actually go to work. Like I myself have already run out of sick leave, mostly because I have children and they get sick all the time. And under COVID, a snotty nose is enough that they have to stay at home. So there's lots of issues there where people are going to be running out of leave, where it's going to get quite tense with work. Work won't. Maybe you have to take unpaid work, and that's where UBI will be fantastic, because you could just take unpaid work and you still get a bit of UBI carrying you through, so you can actually afford to do that, to stay at home a bit more. Especially COVID long haulers, where it seems like some level of base function is actually still achievable, so you should be able to go to work a little bit. Again, that UBI, because it restructures your tax so dramatically, you can afford to take more time off to cope with all of those things.
Yeah, nice. I mean, I do think that's that is really important stuff long term. If we do see this, these sorts of, if chronic fatigue does come out of this sort of issue, then I do think we need to be having these sorts of conversations. But I think more sick leave is probably a good idea as well, Ben, and it's good to hear the politicians are looking at that. It's certainly something that we'd want to be talking about.
It's one of those. It's also kind of interesting, right? Because like there are certain points in your life where you're going to need sick leave an awful lot more than other times. And often like around the time when you're raising a family is one of those times, because kids are sick all the time, especially if they're in daycare. And if you're at work, that's where your children often are. So like early on in your career, you need a whole lot. In the middle of your career, you often don't need much. And then again, near the end, you need some more sick leave. So it's kind of this, perhaps if we had some kind of structure, and I don't know what the solution is. We're just really winging it at the moment. But, thinking about not just every worker is the same in that, and that actually there are periods of time in your life where perhaps if parents got some extra sick leave for the first few years of your child because they are sick so much more than once they're grown up and at school, or as you get older and you need to take more time again to look after your health, then that's something you look at. So some employers do fun things where they let you share your sick leave. So if you've got extra, you can do that, but others don't. So yeah, no, it's very interesting. I think it'll be a good thing to do more sick leave.
Question from Joel. I think this is relating to the conversation we were having about trust at the start, and that these theories circulating on the internet are adding to this distrust of expertise, scientists, and the very idea of truth. How do you handle the situation when your friends and loved ones are sucked down that rabbit hole, so to speak?
Yeah, it's
a tough one, right?
It is, because there are people close to me that I know hold views that are very counter to mainstream. It's really difficult, and I think it kind of it's kind of a bit of a case by case basis, right? For some people, it's simply that you need to take the time to walk through what is the evidence and what we do know, and unfortunately, the media isn't very good at doing that. The media is very good at saying we're right, you're wrong, and if you don't agree with us, you're dumb, right? That's kind of the message that gets told, and it takes a lot of effort to actually go further than that and kind of take their theory seriously. Go, okay, we'll look at what you're saying, and we'll genuinely go, if this is true, what happens? What does the world look like if your worldview is actually true? And taking the time to engage with them and walk through it. And if they are loved ones, if they are close, then you'll have a relationship basis where you can perhaps have those conversations, because they're not going to be easy. You're effectively challenging their entire worldview, and it can be quite comforting to have a worldview where you think you've got the secret knowledge or the thing that's out there to get you as the government, and it's really easy to say, yeah, screw them with whatever they do, and I'm right, and what I'm doing at the moment makes me feel good, so therefore it's right. So there's lots of stuff there, and I think just taking the time to talk through what it actually means if those things are true, it's a lot of these don't hold up very well if you start actually taking them seriously and taking the time to go, okay, let's have a look at what it would mean if what you're saying is true.
Yeah, asking questions about because I guess that's the really interesting thing with a lot of these conspiracy theories. The sheer numbers of people that would need to be in on this stuff is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, or you could do even things like 5G causes cancer or something like that, or 4G causes cancer, which is previous claims. You go, okay, well, let's actually just look at, are we seeing huge numbers of cancer cases around the world? Not really. Like the overall trend is for almost all things are going down. There are some things which are going up, because overall we're living much longer, healthier lives. That then, the longer you live, you get more of the things that are associated with age coming into play. As you're going, actually, when we take a look at this big picture, people are so much healthier that the things that we're trying to avoid and being scared of are harder and harder to find, and so we're then making up our own boogeymen and being afraid of those instead. So it's
and the biggest killer around, biggest increasing killer at the moment is our diet and things like diabetes, right? And we're not freaking out about that nearly as much as we should. Hence, hence Top's health policy released this week. I can squeeze that one in.
Absolutely. I mean, it's important, like what you eat actually really matters, and it's more than just eating. Eating and exercise go really well together, and there are so many good studies showing that exercise is absolutely crucial in order to stay fit and healthy long term. But yeah, what you eat, and again, it's part of that problem where we've had a high cost of living for so long that we're looking for any way to cut down on our expenses, and food is one area where it can be quite easy to go for the cheap option. by balancing that out and making the cheap option actually not that, the unhealthy option not as cheap, and having other options being brought in line, then that actually really helps balance that equation. So I think it's really good.
Question from Ian. About a quarter of New Zealanders are undecided and another quarter unwilling regarding a vaccine. Some feel it is being rushed. Any thoughts?
Yep. I think, again, this comes back to, and our confidence in vaccine has actually decreased since 2015 as well, is that we haven't had a good focus on public health, and that has a big impact. When you make vaccines really easy to access, and you make it very, and you remind people and you keep following up with them, then you tend to have high vaccination rates. A good public health campaign goes an awfully long way. We've managed to reduce smoking to historically low levels because we've had good public health campaigns, right? If we put that back in place, we can actually get there. Prominent figures play a huge role in this. So very popular people going and getting a vaccine and showing it's fine actually does have a big impact on people trusting it. I think it was a Princess Diana doing, she went and got tested for HIV or something like that. I'm kind of clutching at straws as to what that story is, but there have been some really prominent people who have taken a step to go and get a particular test or to receive a particular treatment, which has then made everyone else go, oh, if they're willing to do it, I'm on board again. So I think, I don't know if anyone's got a better story of someone they know very prominently going, oh, yes, that. And especially when the disease is so dissociated for so many of us in New Zealand. Like, I don't actually know anyone that has gone to hospital for COVID. I don't know anyone personally that was sick from COVID because we managed to escape it largely unscathed. So for New Zealand, it will be a bigger battle because we've been much less affected by COVID. For places who have seen the destruction firsthand, I think they'll be much, much higher and much more accepting of a vaccine because they've seen that risk.
This is more of a comment from Joelle. Professor Tate from Otago Uni says chronic fatigue could impact 20% of COVID-19 survivors from the ODT.
Fascinating. Yeah. Warren Tate, Professor Tate, works down the hall from me. He's an emeritus professor there. And fun fact about Professor Tate is that he absolutely loves puns, and he will squeeze them into any comment he can. And he works on chronic fatigue. So I think it is that it is possible that will be having quite an impact. Chronic fatigue as a syndrome is something we don't understand particularly well, especially around what causes it. I think that's, I would take his words with quite a lot of, I agree with him quite a lot. He's quite a well-respected researcher.
Yeah. And another comment from Joelle was Princess Diana, I think, shook hands with HIV patients without gloves.
There we go. That was the one.
Okay.
And so, it is. It's prominent figures can have a huge impact in terms of people's perceptions on health and people's acceptance of various things. And
there was this crazy idea that you could catch HIV from any sort of contact with someone way back in the day, wasn't it?
I mean, it was a terrifying pandemic. I don't know if pandemic's quite the right term. Where one of the other professors that I work with, he was a medical doctor at the time, and while he was practicing his medicine, anyone that came to him that was HIV positive, he would not be able to do absolutely anything for, and he knew that he was looking at a person who would be dead in a couple of years at most.
Gosh.
In his lifetime, we've gotten to a point where it is completely livable, where it has nearly no impact on your overall long-term survivability. And so when we're thinking about the impact of COVID and how we're going long-term, like, we're looking at having a vaccine within a year or two. We're looking at having effective treatments. We've got way better at treating patients already. You look at the daily cases globally are still going up because of mismanagement, but the number of deaths are going down because we're getting better and better actually treating people. And so it blows my mind, actually, the situation we're in, where within a year we've had a horrendous virus that we've been able to kind of get on top of and start having treatments and start having vaccines It's incredible actually where we're at as a society in terms of medicine.
Curly one for you, Ben. This one from Sam. Dr. Ben, what do you think about Sweden's approach? I see the WHO has given them some praise for it recently. And I know this might be a difficult question for you to ask.
That's all right.
But there it is.
There's a lot going on with Sweden. It's fairly politicized, right? Because people put it up as like, oh, we want that, we want what they've got, and it's all around kind of the Swedish approach is a number of different things. So first of all, it's hard to keep the timeline right in your head because everything kind of jumbles, but Sweden is actually the point where there is a reasonable number of restrictions in place. The early idea of just absolutely no restrictions and we'll just try and keep it out of the rest homes was never what they actually wanted to do. They were saying, let's try and have social distancing. We can't put it into law, in part because the legal structure of Sweden didn't allow them to, right? So there's other things going on culturally that need to be understood before you can actually say, oh, they just chose that because it was the best. It was actually they were legally restricted in what they could do. And there are things that they couldn't. New Zealand has a fairly permissive law when it comes around to health. And I mean, we were illegal for 9 days of our lockdown, but we were able to do that. So Sweden's approach overall, it has to fit with the culture. We've seen some places try and do harsher lockdowns that have completely failed. Even though the government did the right thing, it wasn't with the trust of the people. And so really the question is, how or what can you do with the people that you have, with the trust that you have with your people and with your government, rather than what is the best approach? And economically and things like that, I think largely you have to wait to see really what's going on long term. Overall, it seems like harsher lockdowns have been better because they bounce back quicker, but it really depends on what your economy is. If you've got a net export economy, you can afford to do a lockdown, especially something like New Zealand, where all of our farmers kept farming. So all of our agriculture did exactly what agriculture would do. And so large portions of our economy were untouched by a lockdown. If you have a very differently shaped economy, then your lockdown has a very different effect. And lots of other countries don't have the social structure that we do that enables a lockdown. So India was doing fairly well for a very short time until things started running out. And then you go, oh, crap. People were going to die from starvation, and that's worse. So there's lots and lots of things in any kind of whose approach should we go. You go, this is not a matter of lockdown or not. This is a matter of what can we actually achieve? Like really early on, I wrote a piece for Top saying, hey, we should do testing at the border. It'll pick things up way better. We'll be able to keep things fairly open and amicable. I totally misjudged the competency of the government and the Ministry of Health. Like it was an absolute cluster. It was not a good early time in the pandemic for New Zealand. And I was very naive in thinking that they'd be able to pull off something like put in new technology at the border rapidly. Like our early border response was asking people on a questionnaire. It was ridiculous. So like there's lots of things going into it that's more than just what do we think is best, but what can we practically do? What will our people accept? Because at the end of the day, laws, if you pass them, they need to be enforced or they become meaningless. We're seeing that a lot with masks, where sometimes it may not be worth mandating masks if it ends up with a massive negative backlash that people will push back against it, because then you end up worse than before where people hate the government and they're going to start protesting and they're going to start doing X, Y, and Z. Whereas if you just recommend it and then, people go, okay, those small group that won't, but at least they're not protesting that they're just simply not. And so there's all that kind of social stuff that comes in that's so important to a good response.
Yeah.
Sorry, big tangent there.
No. I think that's all totally fair. And I mean, I think your point about the border in New Zealand was part of a much bigger issue, really, that we were horrifically unprepared for this kind of, and this is why, again, Top has been talking about an independent public health commission, so that we have a standing army of public health officials that can be ready for this kind of situation, this kind of pandemic. And
because it's going to happen again.
Exactly.
Like,
I mean, this happens every 10 years, right?
But this was a natural event where a bat virus crossed to a human. That happens. Ebola is another case where you have a zoonotic event. So you have a disease that's living nascent in the animal population and it crosses to people. It happens kind of frequently. Most of the time when it happens, just one person gets sick and the virus doesn't modify itself or evolve enough to then make lots of person-to-person jumps. Sometimes it does. And sometimes we end up living with those viruses like the flu that we currently live with. That's influenza. So to think that this is going to be a one-off that's never happening again is very naive. It's unlikely to happen again in the next year or the next two, but we have to be. Bill Gates, the whole reason he set up his foundation is because he goes, look, this is not the whole foundation, but part of his backing of things is going. We know that the experts are telling us that it's likely that pandemics will happen because we understand how viruses work. We know that they can jump species occasionally, and so we need to prepare for that occasional moment.
You're not supposed to talk about Bill Gates, Ben. You'll be
Fun
targeted.
fact, I have, in a small way, been funded by Bill Gates. This goes right back to my third year of study. I did a studentship with a professor, Russell Poulter, who had a project that was funded by the Bill Gates Foundation to look at a particular homoendonuclease, which means absolutely nothing to most people. Other than that, it was kind of the pre-CRISPR thing that was going to allow us to do really precise edits. Obviously, CRISPR was then found, and that became the big story, and our little protein wasn't going to do anything nearly as good. So I have been none of that money actually made it into my pocket. The things that I used in the lab probably were funded by, in some small way, Bill and Melinda Gates. I think there was about a $50,000 grant that enabled that work. So I'm a Bill Gates shill. You heard it here first.
Awesome. Well, hey, we're coming near the end of our time. Here's one last question for you though, and it's a big one from Jessica. What other kinds of predictable events are we woefully unprepared for? Obviously, climate change is the obvious one, but are there other things that we should be thinking about that we aren't?
Very
of course,
good question.
Climate change has quite a few implications that we should probably be prepared for, such as refugees from the Pacific, perhaps even Australia.
Yep.
Are they
political refugees from Australia or just cultural refugees? No.
Yeah. And potential for greater geopolitical issues elsewhere in the world too. I think clashes between India and China, for example, over water, that sort of stuff. The Middle East. I do think there's a pretty good reason for New Zealand to be working on reducing our dependence on foreign, importing foreign oil, particularly by creating our own electricity to do that. And I think one of the big reasons for that is not just climate change, but also just because I think the Middle East is going to get increasingly, disrupted in the years to come, as we've seen with Syria and the like.
So there's a lot of things. It's hard to go like this one thing we need to start raising an alarm bell about, because anytime you do that, then it gets tricky. I mean, each region in New Zealand has its most likely natural disaster that we should be thinking about and making sure we're well prepared. Dunedin is actually, I think, an earthquake. It would be incredibly devastating. It's one where there's a number of faults around Dunedin.
Right. Yeah. There are faults there, are there? Right.
A lot of faulty people too, myself included. There's faults all over New Zealand, right? And I think in other regions we need to be careful of tsunamis, and in other regions it's volcanic eruptions. There are those natural events that we need to be aware of, and that are, they are known because we keep an eye on things like that, but a lot of those are not very predictable. Health wise, I think like gene therapy is one of those things that is going to revolutionize the way we look at disease, the way we treat disease. The Opportunities Party has a policy around gene editing. I think we need to keep that. We need to get legislation approved around that, so that we don't end up with really weird legal issues where we're suddenly classifying people differently just because they've got a medical treatment. And so that's one thing that I think we need to be kind of front-footing. So there are some gene therapies that will cure some monogenetic disorders that are being trialed around the world, and some of them are in place. And so it's potential for those weird regulatory things. And I think as a country, I think we need to get kind of a better education understanding of what it actually means around what our genomes are and what these treatments are, because as we get more and more knowledge about this, it's going to start impacting our lives more and more. So I think it's not like an immediate doomsday. It's almost the opposite. It's like we've got this revolutionary technology that's on the horizon that we're not really talking about much in the mainstream, because our major political parties are dragging their feet on it as much as possible. So Labour has a policy of we'll just keep the status quo with our genetic editing laws. The Greens are expressly opposed to it, which is very problematic, because I don't think that's even crossed their mind that these cures are coming to New Zealand at some time in the near future, and that's going to have a big impact. So I think that actually starting to go, look, this is incredible that what we can do with this technology, and that's a really good thing that we can actually absolutely front foot. But yeah, otherwise all that geopolitical.
I'd say artificial intelligence and automation as well. I mean, not only for the economic upheaval that's going to bring in terms of in terms of sort of the next industrial revolution. Which I mean, the original industrial revolution caused a massive upheaval in terms of people moving from the country to the cities, and periods of big migration and unemployment. But also, I mean, this really interesting question of what happens when when some form of artificial, true artificial intelligence actually happens, and massive ethical issues, massive ethical issues with that, and potential for Terminator type scenarios as well. So
have you seen those Boston Dynamic videos?
Yes, they're quite extraordinary.
So I mean, like, AI is really on the cusp, and more we're already seeing the impact of algorithms everywhere. Unfortunately, a lot of those algorithms are black box algorithms, so we don't actually know what's going into them. We're getting computers to train computers to recognize things, or to kind of using massive data sets. And so there is a level of irresponsible computing that is definitely going on, and we need to actually start front-footing legislation around that. I know there's some work that's going into that around just digital accountability, making sure if you've got algorithms going in any way that's affecting people's lives, that you actually know what those algorithms are measuring, because algorithms can be just as racist or biased or as people are, because they look at the data sets and they just pick out the things that are common in the data sets. So you start off with a biased data set, you end up with a very biased result. There was a classic example of the Amazon recruitment algorithm that looked at all their successful employees, or the people that they'd metriced on in a particular way, and then it said, right, just find us good workers, and the only example of good they have is previously good, and that was an enormously biased sample. And so then it was actually filtering out anyone with the word woman or girl in it, was just automatically filtered out. And so it was an enormously sexist algorithm, because it had a very biased database to begin. And so it's really it gets problematic. And also, if people get wind of how an algorithm works, then you can game it really quickly. So I remember there was a thing going around when CAPTCHA, so you know how you have to enter 2 words. The first word is the word that's actually checked, and then the second word you can put whatever you want. But the idea of it was that the second word was a genuine thing that they wanted recognized, and so they got people to do their work for them. But once you got wind of what that was, people would start training it to read the wrong word and put in really rude words as the constant thing that it would read. And so, like, there's all of these issues that are coming in, and as we have self-driving cars, I can't wait for self-driving cars because we currently have a horrendous road toll. 5 people have died in Southland just this week, right? Like that's more than our COVID deaths, at least over the same time period. Like our road toll is huge. When we move to a point where we're not going to have those people dying all the time, that's great, but we do have issues of understanding what level of self-driving car is okay, how much can they talk to each other, how secure is that, because there's nothing is ever truly secure. So there's all those nitty-gritty issues, which I think you really want a party that's a little bit front-footing on technology, i.e. top, to actually be in those tables, because although they'll have experts, the government is so selective at which experts they'll bother listening to. They've had, how many tax working groups have they had, Geoff, and then completely ignored? Like, I mean, what are they doing with those experts?
Yeah.
They're not taking it on board. I mean, sometimes you go, oh yes, we've got the best experts, and here you can see it. And we've seen it with the COVID response. Most of the way through, they're really listening to those experts. And that's because they have no idea themselves, and so they have to listen to those experts. Anywhere where they think they've got this bit of a, oh no, I know how tax works. We're just gonna bump that up 2% on some really high income but not wealth.
I saw a rant from Mike Joy today, actually, about this exact topic, because it was in response to the Labor's energy policy, which Labor and the Greens, of course, passed the Zero Carbon Act, which set up this Climate Change Commission. And the first report this Climate Change Commission did said, don't worry about the 100% renewable energy target by 2035. That shouldn't be your focus. Focus on transport and on process heat, because that's the low-hanging fruit. And both Labor and the Greens have gone, okay, well, we'll have a 100% renewable target by 2030 instead of 2035.
Yep.
And it's like, and of course, Mike himself had a experience with being an expert on their water, their water quality group last year, which ended up, ignoring the majority of the scientists' view on nitrogen levels. So, there's plenty of experience with that. Anyway, let's not go down that rabbit hole. But that. Yeah, I mean, wouldn't it be great if we listen to scientists and experts more, as we have done on COVID?
Cool.
Yeah, well, hey, thanks very much again for your time, Dr. Ben. You got anything? You got anything fun for the plan for the weekend?
Sleep.
Sleep.
Yeah, I've got 2 kids, and they love to keep me up at night. So hoping to catch up a wee bit on that. Otherwise, it's going to be a weekend trying to catch up on all my campaigning stuff. Actually, we've got the billboards pretty much all sorted. We had an issue with those, but we've got it sorted. The top car is getting recognised all over town now, which is great.
I've seen the photos. It's amazing.
I had a guy run up to my window and knock on the window and say, "Yeah, you got my party vote," which was both terrifying and very uplifting.
While you were still moving?
Well, I was just stopped at the lights, and he just ran up. I had the kids in the back, and I was like, yeah, but hey, if he's watching, thank you. It's always a bit encouraging. So it's the campaign down here is really picking up. People are recognizing me all the time now because I've got the billboards up all over town, and obviously I'm working at the university. Tons of students are coming in and being like, you're a candidate. So yeah, it's a very exciting time. Hopefully, so a little bit of sleep, a little bit of campaigning, a little bit of family time, I think will be my weekend.
Nice. All right. Well, you have a good one, mate.
You too, Geoff.
Ka kite.
Cool. See you later.